He said he thought his wife had accidentally shot herself. "She's gone," he cried, voice breaking. "Oh God!" Someone nearby barked. "Shut up. Shut up. Just have it." Just moments earlier, 35-year-old Keith Johansen had discovered his wife, Brandy, lifeless on the bedroom floor after a fatal series of shots. As Keith tried to explain the events that led to the shooting, he did not yet know that police were about to uncover horrifying, damning video, footage that recorded many of the couple's actions up through Brandy's final moments. What the officers saw on that footage shocked them. One detective would later describe it as some of the most shocking material he had encountered in his entire law enforcement career. In the recording there were fragments of cruel language, a threat, "I'm going to kill you and go back," and bizarre lines about "put fish hooks in that, because it's not worth nothing now." The scene on tape made it clear this was not a simple, isolated moment. It all began on April 7th, 2018, when Keith Johansen placed a call to Florida police at 10:54 a.m. The 911 operator asked him if he thought Brandy had harmed herself or if it might have been an accident. Keith replied that he believed it was accidental. The operator pressed for details, asking whether Brandy was breathing and whether she could speak. Keith said she was breathing, but could not confirm that she could answer. When the dispatcher urged him to apply pressure to the wound, Keith explained he could not. He said he was wet, slipping on the wooden floors after coming out of the shower, and that he worried about moving her or causing one of the guns to discharge. He begged them to hurry. The dispatcher reassured him that help was en route and that officers were on their way as quickly as possible. But the tone of the 911 call barely hinted at the terrifying scene waiting for officers at 23 Felter Lane. At the house, Keith greeted police in obvious distress. He identified his wife as Brandy Johansen and spelled the surname for them. He told detectives he had gotten out of the shower, made coffee, and then heard 2 loud booms. He said he initially thought the sound was a balloon popping. When the second report rang out, he ran to check and found Brandy on the floor with guns close beside her. He said he immediately called the police. As officers questioned him, they asked routine follow-ups. When had he been in the shower? How long had he been in there? How many shots had he heard? Keith estimated 5 minutes in the shower and told them he had heard 2 shots. He claimed to have found Brandy on the floor afterwards. Curiously, he insisted he had just been in the shower, but did not seem wet. They asked where their son, Ryland, was. Keith said Ryland had been in his own room, watching television and dozing in and out of sleep. His room, Keith explained, was next to the master bedroom, but separated, so he could not see what had happened from where he was. When officers entered the bedroom, they found Brandy lying on the floor between the bed and a nightstand. 2 9mm handguns were strewn nearby, positioned facing one another in a way that struck investigators as odd. Brandy had been shot twice in the chest, yet the wounds did not appear to come from the same firearm. When asked what kind of guns were present, Keith told them both were 9mm. One, he said, was a Beretta, and the other he believed to be a different make. Given the gravity of the scene, officers took the devastating step of informing Keith and 6-year-old Ryland that Brandy had died. As the family sat on the front porch, officers moved to a safer area with Ryland, who was understandably stunned and confused by the news of his mother's passing. Keith reacted with loud, visible grief, repeatedly saying, "She's gone," and begging confirmation. "You serious? Are you sure?" In the immediate aftermath, he said he never wanted anyone in his family to possess a gun again. Still, amid the shock, detectives pressed to reconcile the facts. How could a 25-year-old mother, described as responsible and attentive to her child, have accidentally shot herself twice? Investigators began to suspect that more might be hidden behind the surface story, details that were being kept from them on purpose. At the scene, officers attempted to keep relatives from spiraling further into panic. Someone cautioned the crowd that they did not want anyone to freak out more than what's going on. Voices rose in confusion. "What do I do? I don't know." Another person, distraught, exclaimed, "There's no God." "Huh, there is no God." Soon after, Keith was taken to the police station for questioning, while the rest of the family tried to cope with the sudden and devastating loss. In the quiet moments around the house, small domestic recollections surfaced. The backyard with hammocks, the way Brandy loved to look up at the trees and watch birds and squirrels. Those memories felt painfully ordinary next to the horror that had overtaken their lives. Investigators reconstructed Brandy's recent history. She had finalized a divorce in January 2017 and later married Keith in 2018. The two had first connected in 2014, and Brandy had believed Keith to be the right partner for her and her son. They had moved into a new house and were, by most accounts, trying to build a stable life together. But as detectives spoke with Keith, a discordance emerged between his words and his demeanor. He told them he wanted the process of questioning over so he could begin to grieve. He said the death had shaken his faith and that he could not fathom why it had happened. Yet investigators observed that his reactions often seemed self-focused rather than reflective of an overwhelmingly bereaved spouse. Detective Dunton's first objective was to understand the dynamics of Keith and Brandy's marriage, to paint a full picture of their lives so the facts could be placed in context. He explained to Keith that investigators needed to learn about his life, his marriage, and everything related to their household to better determine what had transpired. At the time of Brandy's death, she was not employed and was focused on parenting Ryland. Keith, by his account, was also not working. He lived off a lump sum settlement he had received because of an injury. When asked to describe their relationship, Keith called it the best he'd had, saying Brandy was everything he wanted, acknowledging that, of course, like any couple they had arguments, but nothing violent. When detectives asked about fidelity, Keith said that, for the most part, they had been faithful. He admitted Brandy had an online thing, sharing videos and interacting with others on the internet, and disclosed that at one point she had performed a sexual act online for fun without telling him. He insisted these interactions had not resulted in physical encounters and maintained he had no reason to lie to investigators. "I got no reason to lie, you guys," he told them. "I mean, you guys are investigators, for God's sake." As the evening wore on, a child forensic team was called to interview Ryland. During that interview, the 6-year-old surprised investigators by revealing something unexpected, a detail that would shift the course of their inquiry and complicate the simple explanations of accident or suicide. That's what I seen, and that's what I heard," Ryland told the forensic interviewer, setting in motion another crucial line of investigation. When forensic interviewers asked the boy what he remembered, Ryland answered simply. His mom had screamed. Then there were 2 gunshots. He told them his dad had been in the shower. His mom had been in her bedroom. "She accidentally shot herself," Ryland said, and when the interviewer asked who had told him that, the child replied, "My dad." The interviewer thanked him and asked what else he had heard. Ryland repeated that he'd heard a little scream before the shots. When asked how that made him feel, he said plainly, "Sad." Investigators were left with a chilling question. How could someone scream and then immediately suffer an unintentional shooting? The timeline Ryland described, a cry, then gunfire, did not fit easily with an accidental discharge. When detectives returned to Keith to relay what Ryland had said, Keith immediately denied the child's account. He told them he'd heard no screams at all and suggested Ryland was prone to lies. "He has been known to tell stories," Keith replied, asking whether the boy might fabricate such a thing. He insisted that Ryland had never claimed before that Mom screams in the bedroom, and he challenged investigators to ask Ryland's biological father if they didn't believe him. Why would he invent that? Keith demanded. You can try to pin whatever you want on me. She didn't scream. But the detectives weren't relying on argument. They were gathering facts. One element that drew their attention at the scene was the house's extensive network of surveillance cameras, inside and outside, in nearly every room that had access to firearms. Those cameras, the detectives believed, might hold the crucial footage they needed. When officers asked whether any cameras covered the bedroom, Keith said no. He claimed there were no cameras inside the bedroom and that the other cameras were offline because their batteries had been removed. He told them he wished the cameras had been on because that would have clarified a lot. Yet when investigators requested the footage, Keith said he did not know where it was stored or how to retrieve it. While he was at the scene, officers observed him repeatedly glued to his phone, which only heightened their suspicion that he was doing something with the recordings, or at least that he seemed unusually preoccupied with them. Throughout questioning, Keith grew defensive and offended. He told the detectives he felt they were trying to pin an accident on him. He asked to speak with his parents and then with a lawyer. At times he appeared particularly uncomfortable when a female detective led the questioning. He asked for a moment to call his family and gather himself. Detectives, sensing his agitation, paused the interrogation to let him consult with counsel. The back and forth at the station was strained. Detectives pointed out the unusual facts. 2 shots fired, 2 wounds, and the physical impossibility of some of Keith's claims. They suggested that if there were residue on his hands from firing a weapon, it might have been washed off if he'd been in the shower, a possibility Keith raised himself. Still, the officers pressed. This was a death, and someone needed to explain what had happened. Keith swore he had nothing to hide. I didn't do it, he told them. I would have owned up if I did. He maintained his innocence, even as the detectives warned him that honesty now would be better than denial later. With no conclusive evidence tying him directly to the death in that first round of questioning, the department released Keith to seek representation. They sent the home's CCTV system off for restoration, a process whose timeline was uncertain. 2 days after the shooting, the medical examiner performed an autopsy on Brandy. The findings complicated the accident narrative. The first chest wound had been caused by a rubber projectile, a so-called rubber bullet, capable of inflicting pain and injury, but designed as a non-lethal round. The second shot, the lethal one, was from a 9mm handgun. It entered the right side of Brandy's chest with such force that it exited her body and struck the nightstand. Ballistic analysis suggested the fatal round had been fired from roughly 3 feet away. Given the nature of the wounds and their trajectories, the examiner ruled Brandy's death a homicide. Then, nearly 3 weeks later, on April 27, 2018, the restored CCTV footage finally arrived. What investigators watched in that material was worse than they had expected. On the recordings, Keith appeared chain-smoking and unleashed a barrage of verbal abuse at Brandy during the couple's hours-long presence in the bedroom on the evening in question. He hurled threats and violent imagery. In the footage, he said things like, "Put fish hooks in that, because it's not worth nothing now, and I'm going to kill you and go back." He spat out invective and contempt, lines that cut deep and cast the morning's events in a far darker light than an accidental shooting. The video captured a sustained pattern of cruelty, Keith cursing, taunting, and threatening Brandy while she sat on the bed, either crying or staring at the wall. He told her she should get out of his life. He said he would hurt her, and he repeatedly reminded her of perceived betrayals. At one point he shouted that she was a cheating scumbag, implying the kind of fury that, in the detective's view, could escalate into violence. On the footage, Brandy's responses were subdued. She wept quietly, appeared resigned, and did not fight back physically. A scene of emotional domination that investigators later described as chilling in its normalcy. In short, the CCTV did not depict an accidental discharge in an otherwise calm household. It showed a night of abuse, threats, and simmering rage, and it left detectives with a very different explanation to test. That Brandy's death occurred within a context of escalating domestic violence rather than through a tragic, isolated accident. Keith's paranoia and anger spiraled as the night dragged on. He believed Brandy had been unfaithful, and in his twisted state of mind, he felt entitled to vent his rage. "You don't care about me?" he snapped. Brandy tried to defend herself. "I do care." But Keith pressed harder, sneering. "Yeah, you like me as a father figure, but you don't give a damn about me." The argument escalated into outright threats. Keith warned that he could kill her and go back to jail, or force her to take sleeping pills and cut it all off quick. At one point, he went to a drawer and pulled out a rifle. "You know what? I'll leave it here," he muttered darkly. "Maybe one day you will." He insisted Brandy had driven him to the edge, telling her she had pushed him into thoughts of violence. Hours of mistreatment followed. Eventually, Keith removed the bedroom camera from its position, unaware that it had already recorded damning evidence of his tirade. That footage would later surface, revealing his cruelty and sealing his fate. On April 7th, just 2 days later, the cameras caught Brandy in a tender moment, speaking softly to her young son Ryland, reassuring him, "I love you. I do." It would be the last recorded image of her alive. Moments later, Keith was seen making the 911 call, fumbling with his jeans and shouting dramatically, "Stay with me, babe. Baby, please stay with us." But while he pleaded into the phone, the video showed something else. Keith frantically stashing narcotics and preparing the house to avoid drug charges, instead of rendering aid to his dying wife. The deception collapsed quickly. Detectives now had video proof that his story of an accidental shooting was a lie. Keith was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. Even from jail, he couldn't keep his story straight. In calls to his parents, he admitted the lawyer had warned him. "With these charges, there's no probation. You're looking at 20 years minimum, 30 years max." Keith was stunned. From there, his narrative shifted again and again. First, he claimed a neighbor had shot Brandy, which was why he carried a gun for protection. Later, in a shocking twist, he even suggested that his 6-year-old son Ryland had pulled the trigger. His parents tried to reason with him. "Keith, he's a little boy. Be honest." But Keith insisted, "I didn't do it. Not to my mind's recollection." Diagnosed with multiple mental health issues, Keith's paranoia and explosive temper had long been a dangerous mix. Investigators dismissed his wild explanations. His escape routes had closed, and with trial looming, prosecutors offered him plea deals, 50 years or 25 to life. He turned them both down. By then, prosecutors were confident. They had hours of video. Keith smoking, raging, threatening, humiliating his wife. They knew that in front of a jury, every word out of his mouth could be weighed against his own recorded actions. Brandy's family braced themselves for the ordeal. Watching the footage in court, her sister admitted, "It was hard. I just wanted to get up and hug her." The defense tried to paint a different picture. They argued Brandy was a heroin addict who had been binging for 10 days. Keith, they claimed, acted in self-defense after she grabbed his gun. Keith himself testified, telling jurors, "I grabbed my gun, she lifted it, and a round went off. Then she cocked it again and pointed it at me, so I fired while retreating." But prosecutors countered with a key weapon of their own, cross-examination. They put Keith under the scrutiny of a sharp female prosecutor, knowing he struggled against strong women. Under her questioning, He admitted lie after lie. He lied to 911 about being on the ground, unable to reach Brandy. He lied to detectives about having no video cameras. He lied for days about the sequence of events. "You're only telling the truth now," the prosecutor pressed, "because you've been caught." On October 28, 2021, after less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Under Florida law, that meant life in prison without the possibility of parole. Keith Johansson, a man consumed by jealousy, paranoia, and rage, had not only sought to control his wife, he had destroyed her. The case raised haunting questions. Was his violence driven purely by suspicion of infidelity, or by something darker within him? For Brandy's family, the answer hardly mattered. The verdict brought justice, but not healing. This is the tragic story of Brandy's final hours, and of a man whose obsession and violence led to his own downfall. If there's another case you'd like us to cover, let us know in the comments below. And remember to like, share, and subscribe to True Crime Documentary Unveiled for more true crime stories. Until next time, stay safe and watch for the next mystery to be unveiled.